Charleston, South Carolina, 1844. In its prime, the city stood as the beating heart of a world sustained by bondage and balance sheets. Ships from Liverpool, Lisbon, and Havana crowded its wharves. Before we get started, please let me know in the comments where you are viewing from and what time you are listening to this narration. The locations and times of day or night that these verified stories reach are of interest to us. The air along East Bay reeked of tar, salt, and rice milling. The creak of rigging mingled with the sharper calls of overseers driving enslaved stevedores at the landing. Every bale and barrel that left those docks carried with it the invisible labor of the thousands whose names appeared only on inventories and probate ledgers. Against this machinery of wealth rose the grand houses of the planter class, avenues lined with live oaks and plastered facades, piazzas trimmed by wrought iron balconies. A stranger could walk those streets and believe in civility's perfection, never seeing just beyond the garden walls the slave quarters crouched in shade, or the patrol wagons that clattered through the alleys enforcing curfew upon the very people who built the city's splendor. Among those houses stood one whose beauty seemed designed to demonstrate the prosperity of its owner. The property of the late Captain Nathaniel Beauregard lay 3 miles upriver from the city proper, on a gentle rise between the Ashley's tidal fingers. Locals called it Belmarray. Its columns, 6 in number and painted blinding white, faced east toward the wharves where Captain Beauregard's ships once loaded rice and indigo bound for northern ports. Behind those columns, unseen except to servants, sprawled the larger reality. A complex of kitchens, stables, workshops, and slave quarters housing more than 50 enslaved people registered with the county tax assessor as productive chattel. Captain Beauregard himself had died the previous March. The coroner's record filed with the Charleston District Court states that, while returning from Savannah in the steamer Magnolia, the deceased fell from deck during a fog, no suspicion of foul play being then present. Witness statements disagreed. Some said they heard raised voices. One claimed to have seen the captain leaning over another man before the fall. But no grand jury was ever convened. The body was never recovered. Within days, his widow, Eleanor Beauregard, became a curiosity, a woman of 28 whose education and efficiency unsettled those accustomed to widows helpless in the face of business. She supervised the burial service herself, refused to don the full trappings of mourning, and returned to Belmarray within the week. When she appeared in public again, it was to summon her husband's attorney and demand execution of the will. The attorney, Pierre Malin, later testified that the widow received him in a temperate mind and with clear speech, though she did exhibit an extraordinary fixation upon the future of certain enslaved persons attached to the household. Her request, written in her own hand upon fine vellum, survives among county files labeled Estate of Beauregard, 1844. It is my wish that Gabriel, a man of mixed complexion aged about 30 years, be manumitted according to law and be given his liberty with support sufficient for maintenance, the said support to be taken from proceeds of my late husband's estate. Under South Carolina law at that time, such an action was virtually impossible. The Yo Act of 1820 had prohibited private manumission except by special petition of the legislature. An enslaved person freed without such authority could be seized and sold again. Moreover, the Negro Acts of 1740 and 1754 required that any emancipated African or mixed-race individual leave the state within a limited time or risk forfeiture of freedom. The law treated emancipation as infection to be contained. Attorney Malin therefore refused the commission. In formal language, he recorded, "Greater than asterisk, I informed Mrs. Beauregard that what she desired lay beyond her authority as a feme soul, and above even the competency of this court, being subject only to the General Assembly. I advised against further agitation of the matter." Instead of yielding, the widow began a personal campaign to compel the impossible. Witnesses later described her visiting clerks at the State House, quoting scripture and the Constitution in equal measure, seeking an audience no legislator would grant. The persistence of her petitions drew attention from her late husband's brother, Ambrose Beauregard, a merchant of some standing who managed the family's shipping office. He approached the Court of Common Pleas alleging mental unsoundness aggravated by bereavement. He requested appointment of a guardian ad litem to oversee the estate. The court assented. Dr. Elias Prudhomme, parish physician of St. Philip's, examined the widow on June 4, 1844. His affidavit reads, "Subject coherent but encumbered by moral delusion respecting one enslaved male, maintains that said person possesses Christian intellect equal to any citizen, and should therefore inherit freedom as reward of merit, displays emotional disturbances when argument contrary presented. Recommends supervision and calming drafts." Eleanor Beauregard answered the affidavit with a single sentence appended in her flourish. "Madness in pursuit of mercy is sanity before God." Under the new guardianship, Ambrose Beauregard assumed partial control of Belmarray. He immediately divided field hands among adjoining plantations and retained a skeleton domestic staff at the main house. In his reports to the court, he listed 25 enslaved persons sold at auction for the preservation of value and recorded the sums with meticulous precision. Among those retained in domestic service was Gabriel Reed, the subject of his sister-in-law's controversy. His name appears on both the property inventory and the captain's earlier testament, valued at $1,300 and described as steward and musician, competent with accounts. During probate review, Ambrose claimed Gabriel's high valuation was due to specialized domestic training, and accused his brother's widow of being unduly devoted to this mulatto servant to scandalous degree. No proof was ever furnished. Insinuation sufficed. Charleston's press scented the matter. The Southern Courier, June 12th issue, ran a column titled "Romantic Delusion of a Widowed Heiress." Its anonymous author wrote, "One hears that piety and reason have yielded alike at Belmarray, where a lady of fortune declares her chattel equal before heaven. Such blasphemy reminds us why the law is wisely paternal." What the column did not print were the conditions inside the house. Surviving notes from Sarah Marrow, lady's maid, preserved decades later in attic papers, give a rarer glimpse. Her cursive halts between dialect and formality. Mrs. sits by the window with book. Reads to Mr. Gabriel when storm blow. He answers soft, careful with his words. Says lightning can't strike same place twice if you forgive it. Last night I hear music, slow like tears. She play, he follow, both stop when thunder loud. I think love sounds same in any tongue. Such passages have kept historians arguing, whether they represent romantic feeling or the only language Sarah Marrow could find for human tenderness forbidden her world to name. By July, Nathaniel Beauregard's debts in New York demanded liquidation of part of the estate. Ambrose petitioned for license to sell surplus property. The court approved without specifying names. Soon afterward, a notice appeared in the Mercury. For sale, excellent house servant, musical, intelligent, no vices. The advertisement's description matched Gabriel Reed word for word. The sale never took place, suggesting interference from within Belmarray. What happened next came chiefly from oral recollection later written down by neighbors. On the night of August 14, 1844, a storm rose so fierce that the slave patrols temporarily abandoned the outer roads. Near midnight, a lantern seen crossing the lawn toward the river vanished among reeds. By morning, Ambrose Beauregard's overseer reported one absentee. Gabriel, mulatto male, 5 feet 10, scar on left wrist. Patrolmen followed the trail for 2 miles. At the edge of the cypress swamp, they found torn fabric soaked in rain, but no body. Ambrose insisted on official report of escape and offered a $50 reward for capture, calling the fugitive property absconded during supervision of an unstable mistress Eleanor denied knowledge. When questioned, she replied, "I freed him where your laws cannot follow." Such defiance ensured her confinement. Ambrose applied again for adjudication of sanity, this time producing depositions from Belmarray staff asserting that the widow conversed at night with voices not present. Judge Peyton accepted the testimony. On August 30th, he ruled, "Whereas Mrs. Eleanor Beauregard has manifested doctrines destructive to social order and may endanger estate and servants, the court appoints Ambrose Beauregard sole administrator and directs that the said Eleanor Beauregard reside under protection at St. Cecilia Refuge until further decree." That order removed her from the house she had tried to reform. It also marked one of the rare 19th century cases in which moral dissent, sympathy toward enslaved people, was judicially defined as insanity. Property disposition followed. Field hands were dispersed among purchasers. Children separated per usual method of sale, by lot, not family. Receipts list 43 individuals transferred for a sum totaling $19,875. Their names survive only as first initials and approximate ages encoded to save ink. Slavery was efficient even in erasure. Belmarray's domestic wing remained shuttered under supervision of a single caretaker. In December, a blaze consumed the East Gallery. No inquest identified cause. Among the debris, the sheriff noted discovery of a steel piano wire and fragments of burned paper bearing partial phrases, "Redeem," from "Power of Grave." They went to evidence, then to dust. The remainder of the record falls silent until the Civil War. When federal troops captured Charleston in 1865, Army surveyors produced a map titled "Abandoned Properties Between Ashley and Stono." Where Belmarray had stood appears a notation in faint blue. "Ruins, bark and iron, called Widow's House." The accompanying list of former owners ends with a single phrase, "All Negroes dispersed, presumed dead or removed." More than a century later, reopened files would reveal that one of those dispersed had signed his name differently. Gabriel Reed, on a Philadelphia emancipation certificate witnessed by attorney Silas North in 1845. How he reached the North remains conjecture. Historians now suggest the night patrol's fugitive lost in swamp reached a hidden abolitionist line operating through ship captains sympathetic to the African church movement. For Eleanor Beauregard, confined in St. Cecilia Refuge, such knowledge never came. The enactment of December 1846 officially ended South Carolina's lingering doubts about private manumission. Any person attempting to free enslaved property without legislative approval now faced criminal prosecution under what planters called the Widow's Statute. Newspapers congratulated the General Assembly for closing the Beauregard loophole, and the text of the law began circulating throughout the Southern circuits as model language. In Charleston, the patrols grew bolder. The lines between police power and personal vengeance blurred until one could barely tell which spoke for the other. Ambrose Beauregard used the statute to consolidate control of his brother's estate. He presented himself as loyal patriot, one who had sacrificed sentiment for order. Letters to his business partners in New Orleans described the disposal of remaining chattel assets in conformity with the new act. Cross-checked with bills of sale, these numbered 19. 5 carpenters, 3 laundresses, 8 field hands, 2 seamstresses, and 1 mulatto man of limited speech. Name uncertain, possibly kin to absconded Gabriel. The price realized would have repaid half of Nathaniel Beauregard's maritime debt to the Haynes Company had Ambrose not quietly retained the proceeds. If the legislature believed its law would quiet dissent, It miscalculated. Behind the facade of civility, a countercurrent of conscience persisted in Charleston's black churches and among a handful of abolition-leaning whites. The African church on Calhoun Street, rebuilt after the Vesey Uprising, held clandestine Bible classes where literate free people of color taught those still enslaved. Their hymnal passed from hand to hand like contraband scripture. Among the songs is one preserved in oral tradition, a minor key lament beginning, "Remember the widow that mercy betrayed." Musicologists now identify the melody as identical in structure to bars of the duet in E minor once ascribed to Gabriel Reed. Northern evidence from that same year confirms he was very much alive. The Philadelphia Manumission Society Journal, a March 1847 entry lists Gabriel Reed, formerly Reed, age 31, employed as teacher of music. Wife Mary Ann Reed, born free seamstress. Small means good conduct. That inclusion placed him among a modest circle of artisans whose homes doubled as meeting places for both worship and political strategy. Archival notices mention him again in 1850 at the address of Silas North's office, assistant and clerk. North by then had become quietly famous among abolitionists for his success in converting contraband bills of sale into instruments of freedom, selling enslaved people to himself in the South for nominal sums, then manumitting them under Northern jurisdiction. Each such case risked prosecution if the subject were recaptured under federal law. But North believed paperwork stronger than chains. South Carolina, infuriated by these legal evasions, demanded federal correction. Senator Calhoun introduced motions asserting state sovereignty over all people of African descent, free or enslaved, within its borders. One clause in his draft specifically denounced wicked Northerners who, like the one North, practice commerce in treachery. The irony escaped him. Eleanor Beauregard, confined within St. Cecilia's, might never have read the political news that turned her name into precedent. Surviving fragments from the refuge's correspondence files show her mental state reframed in clinical language. A letter from matron Margaret Vaughan to Dr. Prudhomme, October 1847, reads, "The patient formerly of Belmarray remains mostly composed. She refuses chapel but requests daily reading aloud from Exodus and Psalms. When asked her reason, she replies, 'Because they are both about escape.'" Another memorandum records that she was permitted to play the institution's chapel organ during services. Attendants remarked upon her skill but warned that her selections were unorthodox, drifting to lamentation at the close. The infirmary steward, less polite, noted in the margin, "She sings like she wants the sky to open." After 1850, the federal government hardened the laws again. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 imposed felony charges on anyone aiding fugitives. Under its new regime, freedom gained in Pennsylvania no longer guaranteed safety. Bounty hunters roamed northern streets armed with warrants and iron manacles. Musicians traveling with free black papers risked seizure if an official doubted their documents. The Reeked. Boston Recorder. August 1851 contains a brief report of mob protest outside a court where a certain colored instructor, well known in musical circles, was accosted by agents claiming Southern authority. The man produced a sealed letter from the Massachusetts governor certifying his manumission under state protection. Testimonies contradict about how he escaped arrest, but later that month the Recorder printed a small ad thanking Friends of Liberty who defended one GRR from forced return. The initials match. The tone suggests gratitude muted by fear. Back in Charleston, Ambrose's reign ended quietly. The Beauregard papers note his death from apoplexy on September 12, 1851. His heirs sold the rice fields to a consortium of planters and moved inland. The main house, largely ruined by the earlier fire, remained standing, shuttered. Insurance assessments list 8 wooden servants' quarters unoccupied. The property passed through sheriff's sale during the Panic of 1857 to northern investors who abandoned it at the outbreak of war. Eleanor's fate emerges only through recently digitized records of St. Cecilia's Asylum. An 1853 admission transfer for Ellen B., age 37, removed to private care in Columbia, corresponds to the final clerk notation, "No further communication." Columbia First Presbyterian burial roster for July 1858 lists Mrs. Ellen Beaumont, no issue. The false surname Beaumont recurs in later references to an anonymous donor who funded free music lessons for colored children in that city the following decade. The connection cannot be proved but feels inevitable. When the Civil War arrived, Charleston burned through its own myths. Union artillery from Morris Island hurled shells whose echoes rolled for miles. Belmarray, by then a ruin colonized by vines, received one of those shells during the 1863 bombardment. An officer in the 54th Massachusetts, whose letters survive in regimental records, wrote, "We struck what locals call the widow's house. As we passed ghosts of columns whitened by moonlight, we heard faint resonance like wires trembling under our boots." The remark reads as metaphor, but veteran searchers claim metallic vibration can indeed travel through soaked timbers when detonations occur. The last antebellum appearance of the Beauregard name in legal indices is 1861, State versus Calhoun et al., where lawyers cited Beauregard Estate versus Reed as historical justification for the sanctity of property rights. Within 4 years, emancipation rendered that precedent meaningless. Gabriel Reed in Northern registers, never returned south. An 1867 Philadelphia directory lists G.R. Reed, teacher of music, colored, 8th Ward. The following year, his obituary appeared in the Christian Recorder, official organ of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Brother Gabriel Reed, once enslaved in Carolina, freed by providence and perseverance, devoted his talents to harmony between men. He taught the psalm as he played it, until the Lord called him home. No mention of Eleanor, no reference to law, only melody. When Reconstruction agents surveyed abandoned plantations for redistribution, investigator Henry Hampton documented Belmarray as uninhabitable ruins, vines hiding iron framework of what seems to have been a pianoforte. He added a marginal note. Strings produce tone when wind strikes them. From every bureaucratic detail, the historian reconstructs the shape of one impossible relationship. An enslaved man transformed into precedent, a white woman into parable, a brother into lawgiver. Around them rotated acts, statutes, manumission loopholes, and the quiet, unstoppable music of conscience, all beating against the codes meant to contain them. When the guns along the harbor finally fell silent and Union troops entered the ruined city in early 1865, Charleston bore no resemblance to the wealthy port that had once dictated the politics of a region. Smoke and mildew filled its houses. Iron fences hung loose from mortar like ribs exposed by starvation. The culture that had codified human property collapsed in a month, but its habits outlived the surrender. The federal authorities put receivers in charge of abandoned plantations, cataloging them as confiscated properties formerly sustaining insurrection by means of slave labor. Each inventory carried both an economic and moral subtext. The first attempt to translate flesh into compensation. Belmarray entered those records as series number 277. Ruined rice estate, owner E. Beauregard, deceased, estate under claim of United States by proclamation. Freedmen who had once toiled there returned to plant kitchen gardens around the shell of the main house. A military agent noted their names and age, describing them as self-emancipated persons formerly of Beauregard tract, seeking restitution of family members sold before the war. The register lists 32 such names, including one Marrow Dinah, likely kin of the lady's maid who had disappeared years before. They built cabins from the debris, some using stone from the fallen portico as hearths. One soldier from Massachusetts wrote home, "It is quiet when the tide rises, then the vines move and you hear something beneath, wire or iron maybe sighing under weight of salt air." In the post-war courtroom, the word slave vanished from statutes, replaced now by freed person, a semantic victory with limited reach. South Carolina's 1865 Black Code required that freed people sign yearly labor contracts. Absence from employment could mean arrest for vagrancy. In practice, many families from the Beauregard tract returned as tenants to the same rice fields they had once worked as property. Bureau agents documented each arrangement. The Freedmen's Bureau roll for Charleston District, April 1867 records. 15 families residing near Belmarray. Land forfeited. Crop division 1/3 to laborers, 2/3 to landholder C. Peyton, northern investor. By then, no one used the name Beauregard aloud. Yet when Bureau officers asked the tenants how they called their settlement, the reply came without hesitation: the widow's place. That oral persistence kept the association alive long after documents had tried to empty it. The first voice to give the site moral meaning after the war belonged to Henry Hampton, previously enslaved on a neighboring plantation and later clerk to the Freedmen's Aid Society. His 1871 pamphlet, Testimonies of Bondage and Deliverance, contains a chapter titled Music Under the Wire. He describes visiting the ruins. "I found there pieces of metal string sounding when wind pressed them. The people say it is the old mistress calling for mercy. I judge it is only wind, but I take the lesson. So must every conscience once bound learn to speak through rust." Hampton's words entered abolitionist literature in the North as allegory. By the time they circulated back south, Charleston society had already decided to bury its guilt beneath marble. Monuments rose to generals, not to those who built their homes. The Beauregard site slipped underground, literally and figuratively, its pieces disappearing into new construction. By the 1890s, rice cultivation collapsed. The marsh reclaimed the dikes, cranes nested in chimneys of what had been parlors. Yet stories endure in peripheral documents, the way echoes survive in minutes of meetings. In 1901, the Charleston Historical Society combined several antebellum estates into a study of notable families of the Low Country. Lisbon. Volume 2 contains a brief footnote. Belmarray, residence of Captain Nathaniel Beauregard, burned during war, remembered chiefly for certain eccentricities of his widow. One paragraph succeeded where years of rumor had failed. It reinvented Eleanor Beauregard as a quaint curiosity, sanitizing her defiance into nervousness. The editors omitted mention of Gabriel Reed entirely, reducing his long resistance to a misheard whisper. During Reconstruction, the period's tangled legal language replaced the old slave codes but continued their logic. Property deeds now used the phrase freed labor. The Charleston Board of Trade Annual Report, 1873, complained that sentimental northern laws hinder the mastery that alone ensures productivity. Behind such phrasing hid the persistence of bondage by contract instead of purchase. Former overseers became managers. Whipping posts were replaced with workhouse debts. Bureau judges recorded cases of assault under breach of agreement rather than cruelty. In this bureaucratic landscape, Gabriel Reed reappeared one last time. Philadelphia archives house correspondence from Reverend William Still, the famed conductor of the Underground Railroad. A letter, September. 1,868 lists contributions by Professor Gabriel R. Reed, late of South Carolina, toward education of freed youth. Accompanying note, His benefaction made with condition that all recipients learn music, for harmony builds nations. The amount, $200, represented years of savings, proof that despite distance he still traced his life back to Charleston, converting bondage's language of accountancy into a currency of generosity. As the 19th century closed, the ruins of Belmarray continued to attract the occasional traveler. An 1898 diary kept by Lydia Prentice, a New York journalist researching haunted Charleston, records her impressions. The road lost itself in reeds, frogs in chorus louder than orchestra. Amongst them a sound not frog nor wind, but something metallic, one long note rising from the wet earth and fading as though a hand had touched and left it. Her short story, later published in the Century magazine, transformed that observation into fiction. She called it The Widow's Keys. Though sensationalized, it reintroduced the setting to new readers just as Jim Crow laws were re-enslaving freedom. By the first decades of the 20th century, Charleston reinvented itself as a city of preservation. Restored facades and manicured gardens sold nostalgia to tourists while concealing poverty just beyond Battery Park. Within that crafted beauty, the notion of the Beauregard affair persisted as gentle ghost story, an urban legend shorn of law and suffering. A 1924 guidebook described a romantic mansion where a lady freed her favorite servant for love. Today one hears their duet when the wind is right. No mention of manumission statutes, auctions, or asylum records. Commerce had finally succeeded where courts could not. It turned rebellion into commodity. Still, law leaves fingerprints harder to polish away. When Charleston's courthouse underwent modernization in 1933, masons removing plaster uncovered a niche stuffed with papers singed at the edges. Among them, a torn page from a ledger labeled Beauregard Estate 1846, disposition of chattel, and the partial minutes of a legislative hearing on the 1846 Act. County clerks, uncertain what to do, forwarded them to Columbia for storage. There they slept until archivists, recataloguing after the Second World War, filed them under miscellaneous slave code references. Those same misfiled pages returned to daylight only when a generation raised on war began hungering for stories of conscience. In 1959, Charleston's archivist historian Harold McLean requested permission to microfilm all material relating to the moral and economic aspects of slavery in the Low Country. His assistants photographed every sheet, however trivial. Roll 17B of the microfilm collection, later misplaced, contained the entire Beauregard docket. McLean's index card describes it bluntly. Woman petitions to free mulatto slave. Legal chaos ensues. Estate dissolved by fire. Act of legislature passed to stop it. He noted the fragments of music on one paper as peculiar decoration. When the civil rights era erupted, that card became a fuse. In 1961, a graduate assistant named Catherine Vale, 26, Radcliffe College, arrived in Charleston to study antebellum manumission procedures. Board clerks steered her to the dusty reels. She spent nights under the courthouse dome taking notes as cleaners swept around her. The guards remember her humming while threading microfilm through the lamp, perhaps replicating the tune drawn faintly on the vellum sheets she examined. Her notes, now preserved at Harvard, show a sharp legal mind and a growing sense that she had stumbled upon something larger. The Beauregard woman, she wrote, was not mad but methodical. She exploited every legal crack until male administrators declared her delusional to close them. One margin quote from her journal repeats a phrase from Eleanor's petitions: "Conscience does not require permission." In early 1963, Vale wrote to her advisor, Dr. Julian Trent, "Found manumission deed disguised as sale to northern lawyer. Clever exploitation of interstate commerce clause. Need to verify other cases." returning to Charleston tomorrow for field survey of site. A week later, Charleston police filed a missing person report. Her car was discovered on the overgrown road that once led to Belmarray. Keys in ignition, recorder on seat, battery dead. Officers canvassed the area for 3 days. Rain washed out tracks by morning. The report concluded simply, presumed lost in marshland. The recorder survived. Its last 12 minutes, static and wind, contained faint rhythm. 3 notes repeating, then silence, as if something metallic flexed in the background. Dr. Trent, crushed by her disappearance, abandoned his teaching and retired north. For decades, the tape gathered dust with the rest of the confusing, half-burned evidence. By the 1980s, Charleston itself was ready to revisit the past it had spent generations polishing out of sight. Restoration efforts in the district turned up foundations of slave quarters. Tourists began asking questions the city could no longer deflect. McLean's successors opened the archives anew, and among the microfilm's technicians rediscovered Roll 17B. In those ghostly grays appeared legible portions of Eleanor's first petition, complete with her handwriting. Below the text, in different ink, someone, perhaps Gabriel Reed, had written the musical line previously misinterpreted as ornamentation. The pattern matched the 5-bar introduction of a composition published in Boston in 1852 as Duet in E minor for pianoforte RGR North. The finding electrified historians. For the first time, art and archive converged. Scholars traced the Boston publication to Silas North's printing house, confirming that Gabriel, freed under Pennsylvania jurisdiction, later worked alongside him editing hymnals for the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Measured against that evidence, Charleston's long myth of suicide collapsed. The lost servant had not died in the swamp. He had survived, composed, and sent his melody back indirectly through publication. The law that forbade his name had become his distributor. Charleston's newspapers of the 1980s treated the discovery half seriously, half theatrically. Headlines read, "Ghost Music Solves 140-Year Mystery." Reports blended romance and scholarship until the distinction vanished again. Visitors flocked to the marsh, journalists, parapsychologists, and finally television crews, for the inevitable true story documentary. Producers quoted act numbers and court verses, their cameras loving the contrast between decaying iron fence posts and magnolia blossoms. By the time the network special aired in 1989, the Beauregard affair had re-entered public imagination not as jurisprudence but as morality play. Yet a quiet lineage of serious work continued beneath the sensationalism. Archivist Caroline Drayton, then a doctoral intern from Tulane University, revisited every document, matching legislative transcripts, asylum logs, and ship manifests. Her 1991 paper for the Southern Historical Review re-established chronology. Petition 1844, Court Injunction 1844, Fire 1846, Act 1846, Asylum 1853, Death 1858, Northern Publication 1852. In an appendix, she included facsimile of the 1846 statute's final clause, "Mercy without sanction is treason against property." Next to it, she placed a single staff of the E minor duet, remarking, "Time has ruled otherwise." As scholarship accumulated, Charleston's conscience changed key. Throughout the 1990s, civil rights educators used the Beauregard materials to teach how statutes shape morality. Law journals dissected the contradiction between antebellum manumission codes and the natural law arguments Eleanor had voiced a century earlier. In 1997, Columbia University organized an exhibition titled Interdicted Mercy, Documents from the Beauregard Case. One display juxtaposed the legislative manuscript, the Philadelphia manumission certificate of Gabriel Reed, and Catherine Vale's water-stained notebook recovered from the archives. Visitors described standing before the glass and hearing faint hum from recorded playback of the restored duet in E minor. Whether the vibration came from flawed speakers or from sympathetic resonance, no one tested closely. From that moment, the Beauregard inheritance ceased belonging to any single scholar. It passed into collective custody, half legal case, half requiem. Eleanor's lunacy petition became graduate coursework on gendered property rights. Gabriel's composition entered anthologies of early African-American music. Catherine Vale's disappearance turned into a cautionary tale on how archives consume those who open them too widely. Charleston responded the way cities always do when haunted. It turned its ghosts into attractions. By 2000, tour brochures offered evening walks to the widow's place, complete with sound effects of wind through reeds. Guides recited the lighter version, a doomed romance beneath the Spanish moss, while the real documents slept again in acid-free boxes 2 miles away. By the first decade of the new millennium, South Carolina marketed its painful history with the same tact it once used to conceal it. Bulletins inviting visitors to walk in the footsteps of the antebellum age spoke more about architecture than bondage. Yet curiosity once planted burrows deeper than civic public relations could manage. Students studying the 1846 laws, the act to prevent the clandestine emancipation of slaves, wanted to see what conscience had cost. The documents of the Beauregard estate, repeatedly exhumed, became touchstones, mirror and warning at once. In 2001, the Charleston Museum mounted its first full exhibit drawn entirely from those files. The Widow and the Law, documents from Belmarray, 1844–46, displayed petitions, inventories, and the tiny scrap of manuscript showing both Eleanor's and Gabriel's handwriting on a single page. The descriptive placard no longer called her mad. It read instead, "She practiced an act of civil disobedience before the term existed. Visitors lingered longest before the line of musical notation. Museum acoustics carried the low buzz of climate controls in the same E minor register as the recovered fragment. Children tugged their parents' arms, asking if someone was playing in another room." At the university, Caroline Drayton became the exhibit's informal curator. She arranged lectures pairing historians with musicians. Legal scholars discussed Prigg versus Pennsylvania and the 1846 statute, explaining how states crafted morality through economic interest. Musicians played the reconstructed duet, pausing midway to show where the printed version uses one accidental that Eleanor's sketch lacked. As if in his conscience, Gabriel could not reproduce exactly the chord she had written. The small discord served as signature. Audiences wept. The city government followed reluctantly. In 2003, the mayor's office on cultural affairs approved a bronze marker at the Belmarray site. The text passed through months of negotiation. Early drafts sanitized, later ones restored legal language word for word. The final plaque reads, "On this ground in 1844 stood Belmarray, estate of Captain Nathaniel Beauregard. Here his widow Eleanor petitioned the courts to free an enslaved man, Gabriel Reed, defying the laws of South Carolina. Her act inspired legislation forbidding private emancipation and became emblem of conscience in bondage. The music of their story endures beyond statute. Every year since, a small group of students perform the duet in E minor beside the marker at dusk. The audience is usually small, locals, tourists, an occasional law student milking a thesis topic. But recordings of the performance circulate online under new names. The Widow's Keys, Music Under the Wire, or simply Belmarray. Each post accrues comments from strangers. "My grandmother sang this without knowing its source," or "My child plays it for recital, I tell her it used to be illegal." The broader public first encountered the case anew in 2005 when the cable network History Americana aired a 2-hour special titled Charleston's Forbidden Legacy. Producers shot reenactments in candlelit rooms, actors reading from authentic court transcripts. Voiceover narrated. In a state where freeing a slave required an act of legislature, one woman's conscience confronted property law itself. Despite sentimental editing, the program quoted the original statutes accurately and ended with the simple camera move. Slow zoom on the iron strings pulled from the marsh, humming under the pressure of wind. The broadcast generated both pilgrimage and backlash. Descendants of the Beauregards, long anonymous, issued statements calling the portrayal exaggerated melodrama and libel on our ancestors. Activists countered with public readings of the 1846 Act outside the courthouse. The exposure forced city officials to reopen sealed files for authenticity inquiries. An archivist reviewing those bundles discovered new material. A folded letter signed M.H., believed to be Martin Hayes, the Boston attorney who had handled Eleanor's covert trust. Dated June 1848, it reads, "I forward by discreet vessel the copy of Freedom Certificate for your ward Gr. Should Providence ever soften this land, ask that he play again the melody you conceived together, for in harmony posterity apprehends justice." Authenticity verified, provenance uncertain, the letter added 16 new words to Charleston's vocabulary of penance. During the next decade, academic interest shifted from morality tales to systems analysis. Economists at the University of South Carolina used the Beauregard probate ledgers to model slave capital depreciation and to demonstrate how the 1846 legislation preserved investor confidence by criminalizing compassion. Their graphs, though cold, rendered the ideology naked. Law professors adopted the case into syllabi alongside Dred Scott and Amistad. The widow who had once terrified her neighbors became a case study measuring jurisprudence against individual conscience. On the cultural front, the Beauregard duet entered standard concert repertoire for black classical ensembles. The 2008 Charleston Spoleto Festival opened with a full orchestral adaptation. Conductor Marvin Fields introduced it as South Carolina finally listening to its own echo. When press microphones caught the last sustained minor chord reverberating through the Gaillard Auditorium, reporters noted that some in the audience bowed heads as though attending Mass. Yet consensus remained impossible. Local newspapers worried, as they had since 1846, that outsiders use rare acts of defiance to indict an entire heritage. Editorials criticized what they called the industry of remorse. Heritage groups argued that Eleanor's petition, noble though it was, did not represent the region, while community leaders insisted that acknowledging exceptions dignified no one. Beneath bureaucratic courtesy, the same divide persisted, law's ancient fear of mercy. In 2011, rainstorms heavy as legends flooded the Ashley again. Construction workers restoring levees uncovered bricks and fragments of glass. They called preservation officials, who identified the layer as part of the 1846 collapse. Among debris lay another piece of metal, curved, etched faintly with musical staves. Testing confirmed it as sheet brass from a piano's internal soundboard. When cleaned, the fragment produced faint vibration when held to ear, as though memory insisted on being heard materially. The find joined the rest of the artifacts in Charleston Museum's climate-controlled case. Today, the Belmarray material occupies one of the museum's smallest rooms, yet its narrative spans legislative, artistic, and human history. The curator's voice reading to school groups now begins not with romance, but with law. In 1844, South Carolina forbade mercy without statute. She points to the next exhibit, Eleanor's petition page, and lets the children read the impossible request. to grant freedom not in fear, but in faith. When the class moves on, she turns down lights and only the faint hum of dehumidifiers remains, pitched perhaps by design, in the same key as the first bar of the duet. So the Beauregard inheritance survives, part cautionary tale, part requiem, part living brief in the endless case of conscience versus code. Walk north along the river after dark and you can still see the new plaque catch reflection from headlights, lettering bright against black water. Sometimes the driver who passes may notice, audibly or only in mind, a low resonance rising from marsh to road, a sound halfway between wind and string. If that traveler slows, windows down, they catch more than the hum. A cadence lifts, unresolved but clear, as if two notes from history finally found one another and refused still to fade. Rain slicks Charleston's narrow streets most evenings in late spring. The sound that rises from the cobblestones is half percussion, half whisper, as if the city exhales through every crack it paved over. On nights like this, the pedestrians who pause at the river walkway hear what they have always heard. One tone, low and constant, somewhere between machinery and memory. Science explains it as the resonance of wind through floodgates. Locals, smiling, call it the widow's note. The historian's instinct is to demand proof, paper, seal, signature. But Charleston has taught a harder lesson. Sometimes the evidence that endures is vibration. The first petition Eleanor Beauregard filed in 1844 spoke in sentences shaped by legal grammar, to permanently manumit one enslaved male known as Gabriel. Since then, the meaning of those words has drifted far beyond the case that spawned them. Each era has rewritten the plea, each listener has changed key. The 21st century's custodians of that echo work behind glass. Their hands move across keyboards, scanning faded ink into electric permanence. Metadata joins parchment, file numbers, accession dates, digital signatures. Every beep of the scanner adds another layer of sound to the long symphony of documentation. Law bleeds into art once again, not because either changed, but because preservation itself has become performance. A new generation of scholars regards the Beauregard case not as curiosity but as prototype. Within its arguments lie the contradictory DNA of American jurisprudence, the conviction that law can consecrate injustice and the equal conviction that appeal to conscience may repair it. Seminars quote the statute's crucial sentence, "Mercy without sanction is treason against property," and trace how that logic survived into segregation codes, then morphed again into other exclusions. In each retelling, Eleanor is no longer a saint or outcast, but an early example of civil disobedience written in the vocabulary of domestic propriety. Musicians, too, keep returning to the duet. Digital restoration recovered the complete score in 2016 from a water-damaged copy held at Philadelphia's Allen Library. They discovered 4 previously unread measures. A slow modulation shifting suddenly from E minor to G major before circling back, unfinished, like breath before confession. The conductor who premiered the reconstruction described that passage as the sound of conscience arguing with fact. Each performance ends on the unresolved chord she left. Audiences never clap immediately. The silence afterward completes the composition. Every May, during Charleston's Spoleto Festival, the city schedules one midnight presentation at the Marsh Outlook. The site remains closed to tourists the rest of the year, but this night the path is lit by floating lamps. At precisely midnight, a pianist plays the duet on an electric keyboard powered by small generator. No amplification, only those close enough hear more than the breeze. At the last cadence, the generator clicks off, leaving only the natural resonance of reeds and water answering the final chord. No program notes explain it. No monument identifies it as penance. It simply exists, a ritual replacing formal apology. Somewhere in archives far from the performance, the physical remnants of that song, iron wire, brass key, burned paper, rest under inert argon gas at controlled temperature and humidity. Each bears a barcode tag beginning with code BM1844. A teenager assigned to catalog them during an internship wrote in the digital log, "Specimens emit faint metallic smell when case first opened. Effect similar to thunderstorm." He didn't know he had just repeated almost word for word Henry Hampton's observation from 1871. Worldwide, replicas of the exhibit now travel among museums devoted to the study of slavery and law. Panels list legislation, valuations, price of human life translated into today's currency. One corner of every display holds a small speaker looping the widow's note. Children lean close and ask what instrument makes that sound. The guide answers, "History. It is both truthful and kind." The Beauregard descendants, after generations of silence, eventually joined the conversation. In 2019, they funded a scholarship for African American music students titled the Eleanor and Gabriel Award for Harmony Across History. Its charter opens with a line from Eleanor's surviving letter, "If heaven holds mercy, it holds it for both." That act of restitution, small as it may appear, closed a circle tighter than any statute ever had. Property line become lifeline. A century and 3/4 after the first petition, South Carolina's legislature revisited its own archives. On the anniversary of the 1846 Act's ratification, state senators introduced a ceremonial resolution acknowledging that the law served to criminalize compassion and to deny humanity's natural claim to freedom. The resolution passed without dissent. No speeches, no celebration, only a quiet signing beneath the rotunda. One attendee described hearing the rain on the dome echo like a drum roll held too long. Another said the sound reminded her of piano strings tightening before performance. Late that night, a handful of residents walked again to the Belmarray rails. The sky cleared. Moonlight turned the marsh silver. A gust crossed the reeds, then another, and for one suspended moment the low hum returned, distinct and steady like a bow drawn across metal. Whether coincidence or miracle mattered less than recognition. Someone whispered lines from a 19th century sermon. "Mercy is law remembered in heaven." The group stayed until dawn. When they left, only footprints remained, already filling with water. Every society needs its ghost stories. Charleston's, for nearly 2 centuries, has been this one. In it are contained the questions the city still asks itself: how laws written to preserve ownership can ever reconcile with the need to love, how memory survives the very instruments built to erase it. Each document, each piano key, each whisper of music complicates the myth of virtue the city sells, forcing a more difficult truth: that beauty here was always twinned with bondage, and that redemption, like melody, demands repetition. Scholars working today call what continues archival resonance. They speak in carefully footnoted language, but what they truly mean is simpler: that some injustices remain audible. The line between legality and morality continues to oscillate, like 2 strings plucked almost in tune. Perhaps that is the lesson Belmarray continues to teach: the impossibility of silence where conscience has already turned into song. So the narrative ends where it began, beside the river. Fog rises, lanterns outline columns that no longer stand. From somewhere unseen comes a faint progression. The first bar of the duet, cautious, yearning. Then interruption, wind across wire, then the answering chord. The sound gathers and thins, fading into tide. In its stead remains only the principle inscribed by a long-gone widow on paper that refused to burn. To grant freedom not in fear, but in faith.